Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club as we continue our reading of The Man Who Couldn't Be Killed, the true and unforgettable story of faith and miraculous deliverance in communist China at the height of the Cultural Revolution, written by Stanley Maxwell. In our last reading, we covered chapters 20 and 21, where Mr. Wang experienced his first miracle. One of the prisoners who had worked with him in the hospital with Dr. Lai, and who had showed an interest in learning about Jesus, turned out to be a Judas and betrayed him to the guards. In order to gain merit and favor with the guards, the prisoner Li Man Kai offered to tie Mr. Wang to a post with a special knot that couldn't be untied, and leave him out in the freezing winter wind overnight. The temperature fell to 36 degrees below Celsius, and the officer guarding Mr. Wang had to go inside to escape the freezing cold. Mr. Wang prayed that he didn't mind dying a martyr's death, as the freezing temperatures were sure to kill him, but he preferred to die in a manner that would bring greater glory to God. Immediately, he felt a presence behind him, and the rope fell away from his wrists, and he was free. He spent the night moving around and exercising, and when the dawn broke and he couldn't retie his hands behind his back, he prayed again, and the angel retied his hands. When the sun rose, neither the guards nor the inmates could believe he had survived. They all looked at him with a sense of awe and reverence, and he was left alone for some time. In chapter 21, Mr. Wang worked with another prisoner whose mother was a Christian and who asked to learn about Jesus. Because they worked at a grindstone, it was easy to talk, and Mr. Wang taught him about the 10 regulations, which the prisoner memorized, and after sharing many Bible stories with him, the prisoner, Ding Choi, accepted Jesus as his friend and Savior. Some weeks later, both Mr. Choi and Mr. Wang were called before all the prisoners by the guards. Their conversations had been overheard, and Mr. Choi was ordered by the supervisor to repeat what Mr. Wang had taught him as evidence of Wang's proselytizing. In front of 300 prisoners, Mr. Choi repeated the 10 regulations, and many of the prisoners whispered that they had broken some of these regulations while they were now in prison. Mr. Choi was not punished, and Mr. Wang rejoiced at the witness and the faithfulness of his friend, even though he himself was punished by being handcuffed each night. We continue our reading today with chapter 22, entitled Treacherous Uncles, and chapter 23, entitled Icy Canals and Wild Dogs. We begin our reading of chapter 22, entitled Treacherous Uncles, as we take a look at Mr. Wang's family left back in Shanghai. The guard entered Mr. Wang's niche with a letter in his hand. "Your daughters refuse to work for the government if they have to work on Saturdays. They're clinging to their superstition," he scolded. "You should advise them to give up their God and support the party. Do your fatherly duty and tell them to read Chairman Mao's sayings." Solemnly, the guard handed Mr. Wang the letter. Mr. Wang knew that all mail to prisoners was censored. The guard's demand brought joy to his heart. After the guard had left, he tore a strip off the side of the envelope, which the guard had resealed, and drew out the letter. Smiling, he read it, then dug out his collection of short notes the government allowed his children to write him monthly. Taking them out of their envelopes, he reread them. These precious children warmed his heart. In the latest letter, Mei wrote that she had finished school and had requested work with Sabbath off. He praised God that she had chosen to please the real God and to follow his 10 regulations. They must have grown considerably in the last 4 years, he thought. He tried to imagine Mei. She was in her early teens when he last saw her in Shanghai's Dilanchao prison. He could scarcely picture her as a young woman entering the people's working paradise. How did his little girls look now? When he last saw them, Lin was 10 and little Doll only 6. Maybe he idealized his children too much. He worried that the government might not provide work for Mei Mei unless it included Saturday shifts. Holding the letters, he pleaded with his friend to help her remain firm to her convictions and survive any hardship resulting from her decision to please him. He wondered how the real God would overrule the party's efforts to sever his daughters from their superstition. Answering the door in the Wang apartment in Shanghai, Mei Mei saw the telephone operator gesturing an imaginary receiver to her ear. She shouted repeatedly, "Telephone!" with a mixture of urgency and impatience. "Coming! Coming!" Mei Mei replied as she followed the woman down 3 flights of steps through the courtyard to the telephone booth. The operator handed the receiver to Mei Mei. A strange feminine voice on the other side of the line asked who she was. Mei Mei gave her name, and the caller said in a shrill staccato, "Same time!" Then the phone went dead. Mei Mei knew the message came from the underground church. Because phones were often tapped, instructions were given in code. She handed the phone back to the operator, then set out to meet the caller. According to the code, same time meant in front of the post office. Looking at her watch, Mei Mei realized she must hurry. When a bus stopped, she crowded on board, paid the ticket taker, and pressed through the crowd until she could watch from the back window. After a few stops, she saw the post office and called out, "Stop!" As she got off the bus, she heard drums. A procession of middle school students dressed in Olive Liberation Army uniforms with red shoulder badges was marching past. Crowds gathered to watch the ceremony. At not knowing whom she was to meet, Mei Mei joined the onlookers. The leader of the procession carried the flag of New China, bright red with a cluster of golden stars in its upper left corner. Her heart filled with pride for her country, for Mei Mei loved China, even though it had arrested her father. Inspired by the procession, she heard the students in the parade shout patriotic slogans about the honorable peasants in Xinjiang province, and wondered why Shanghainese would be interested in people as far away as the westernmost Chinese province. A middle-aged woman brushed against Mei Mei, and she felt folded paper pressed into her palm, a 10 renminbi note. This was the signal that the woman was from the underground church. "Come with me," the woman said when the procession had passed. They maneuvered through the crowd, turning onto a back street where they could make more headway. "What's the procession all about?" Mei Mei asked. "Celebrating Chairman Mao's latest campaign, the Xinjiang movement," the woman replied. "The government wants to provide work for the youth who are graduating from middle school. The neighborhood committees tell the graduates who are looking for work that it's patriotic for the youth to break with the decadent city life, go to the countryside, and learn from the peasants." They turned up an alley, took a main street, and stopped at the entrance to Renmin Park. The woman bought 2 tickets and handed one to Mei Mei, and they passed through the gate. Spotting an empty park bench, the woman said, "Let's sit and talk." Mei Mei had a question ready. "I'm finishing middle school this year, and I need a job. Do you think I should volunteer to go to Xinjiang?" "I think I see someone who can answer that question, Mei Mei." After looking both ways down the trail, Mei Mei saw Pastor Chu and Elder Shu coming toward them. When the 2 men arrived, they sat on either side of the women. "How are you, Pastor Chu?" the middle-aged woman asked. "Mei Mei has a question for you." "What's that?" the pastor smiled, but his eyes dashed everywhere, searching for secret police. She's old enough to work now, the woman said. We have known each other for a long time. May I talk to you as a father? Ever since Mr. Wang's conviction, Charlie Chu had taken a father's interest in Mr. Wang's children. He had encouraged church members to make clothes for them and to donate money and medicine. Mei Mei and her brother often told him of their problems. She respected her pastor's advice. Your future is not your own, the pastor said. You must consider your father in the labor camp. When his prison term ends, he'll want to return home. And while others might disagree, I think the government will allow him to. Be patient, Mei Mei, because he needs you to keep in contact with him. In the meantime, the government will be offering you a job, so you must think carefully. What should I do, Pastor? Mei Mei asked. You must stay in Shanghai. Will the government offer me a job in Shanghai? Your father is a counter-revolutionary in a hard labor camp. That puts a black mark on your record, Mei Mei, so the party will test your loyalty. Mei Mei knew that the government would try to get her to join the glorious Xinjiang movement and work with the peasants. It's easy to request transfers from the city to the countryside, the pastor said, but the government is very strict on transfers to the city. Your father is in the countryside. To get permission to transfer to the city, he needs family in Shanghai. If you go to the countryside, it will be impossible for you to return to the city when your father is released, and thus it will be impossible for him to get a transfer back to Shanghai. Without your help, he will have to live the rest of his days in Xinghai near the hard labor camp. We will do everything we can to help. Now, I must go. The pastor left immediately. Crowds entered the park. With so many eyes, it paid to be careful. The other two church members parted, going separate ways. Mei Mei remained on the bench, mulling over the pastor's words. While she appreciated his kindness, she knew the church members couldn't provide her with steady employment. They gave offerings and clothes, but as the government sporadically arrested one church leader after another, it would become increasingly difficult for those who were left to aid the Wang family. Besides, she didn't want to depend on them. She wanted job security with a regular salary so she could provide for her brother and sisters, and perhaps help other needy church members. The shadows grew long. Mei Mei left the park the same way she had come. Several days later, a knock at the door caused Mei Mei to put aside her studies. When she answered the knock, some neighborhood committee members, accompanied by two of her uncles, stood in the doorway. They had stern looks on their faces. Mei Mei invited them in, dreading the news that they might bring, wondering why her uncles had accompanied the strangers. Taking them to the living room where her sisters were studying, she disappeared, leaving her sisters to chit-chat with the guests while she prepared some boiled water. Moments later, she returned and poured the water into teacups. As they sat around the table drinking, a neighborhood committee said, "Maybe you have noticed the processions honoring patriotic youth." Mei Mei remembered what the pastor had said about her father, the Xinjiang movement, and leaving Shanghai. The member asked, "How old are you, Mei Mei?" 18. You will soon be finishing middle school and will need a job," the member said. I requested a job with no Saturday work. Mei Mei felt tense, wishing they would leave. I cannot work Sabbath. A member laughed. Her elder uncle asked, "Has the government offered you work yet?" "You'll be honored to know the government's chosen you to join the Xinjiang movement," the leader said with a smile. "We'll arrange a glorious procession for you. With your new Liberation Army clothes, you'll be the envy of Shanghai's youth." "This is a tremendous opportunity for you, Mei Mei," her younger uncle added. "New China needs the vitality of her youth, and the youth need to learn from the peasants how to strengthen our agriculture." They talked on and on, trying to persuade Mei Mei to go, but she couldn't get excited. She thought about her father's return. Who would take care of her brother and sisters if she went? Lee, because of his tuberculosis, seemed too weak and distracted to be head of the household. If he had another bout of illness, who would nurse him and provide for Lynn and little Doll? How she needed her father's advice. Why had two of her uncles accompanied the neighborhood committee representatives? When she could hold her emotions no longer, she said, "Maybe I'll think about it. This is a new idea for me." Her guests got up to go. "Maybe this is the only job the government will offer you," Elder Uncle said as he walked down the hall. "Think seriously about taking it. Not all the middle school students in Shanghai are offered jobs. You're lucky, and the pay is good." When they left, Mei Mei hoped she would never see them again. Returning to the living room, Mei Mei wrote a note to Pastor Charlie Chu, inviting him to her house for dinner in 3 days. He would understand the code, and the government would suspect nothing. They would meet on a park bench in the Shanghai Zoo at about dinner time. For the next 3 days, either her uncles or members of the neighborhood committee kept knocking at her door, demanding a reply to the job offer. At the appointed time for the appointment with the pastor, Mei Mei left her house carrying plastic bags so her neighbors would think she was going shopping. Certain that no one had noticed her, she slipped into a back alley, watching for strange people who might be in pursuit. Nearing the zoo, she joined the crowds. Finding the usual park bench, she sat down and waited. When she saw Pastor Chu coming, she made no sign of recognition. He sat on the other end of the bench, and for a time, neither spoke. Charlie Chu broke the silence. "Has the government offered you a job yet, Mei Mei?" "The neighborhood committee visits me all hours of the day and night, asking me to go to Xinjiang," Mei Mei replied without looking at Pastor Chu. "If it were only the neighborhood committee asking me to go, the decision would be easy. But my uncles also want me to go." "Do you remember our discussion after the parade?" "Yes. I must think about my father." "Your uncles aren't Christians. They don't think your father will ever come back." The pastor turned and looked at Mei Mei for the first time in their conversation. "Tell me, truly, do you believe your father will return to Shanghai?" "I'm not sure." "Mei Mei, with God, anything is possible," he said firmly. "The underground church and God will provide for you and your sisters, but you must stay in Shanghai. Act in faith." He stood up. "You're invited to eat at our house Wednesday for dinner." Without saying farewell, he left. As the pastor lost himself in the crowd, Mei Mei considered the code he had given. She was to meet with the underground church members in the zoo on Wednesday night for Vespers. Probably the church members would take up an offering to encourage her. Mei Mei dreaded to go home from school the next day because she feared the visits of the neighborhood committee. So she dawdled, sitting on the benches in the Renmin Park and hiding in secret corners behind the bushes where no one would see her. She tried to muster the courage to go home and face her uncles, but she hated the nagging. Finally, duty called. As the oldest sister, she had to prepare meals for the family. Torn between her duty to her brothers and sisters and her desire to avoid conflict with the neighborhood committee and her uncles, the reluctant young woman left the park and trudged home. She ascended the 3-story steps, hoping to hear that the committee members had given up waiting for her. At the top of the stairs, she opened the door and darted into the kitchen. As she boiled rice, she failed to notice someone enter. Startled, Mei Mei looked up to see her 2 uncles. Before Mei Mei could greet them, Elder Uncle leaned his head back into the hallway and called, "May May's come already." Instantly, the kitchen became crowded with neighborhood committee members hovering around her, making it both physically and emotionally difficult for her to cook. "Are you going to Xinjiang?" they hopped. "The government needs to know your decision." "Why can't you decide?" her uncles yelled even louder. "Either you love New China or you don't. Are you loyal to Chairman Mao? If you are, going to Xinjiang is the perfect way to show it." "You're the daughter of a counter-revolutionary," younger uncle said harshly. "The government is being kind to offer you such a heroic task." "Besides," elder uncle shouted, "Chairman Mao will provide wealth for you. You'll get new Liberation Army uniforms and a house. By delaying your decision, you're insulting our leaders." May didn't dare respond, for anything she said might later be used against her, so she just stirred the rice. "As your elder uncle, I insist you commit yourself today," the older uncle said. "Will you disgrace me by not listening to my advice?" May took the rice off the stove. Carrying it down the hall, she placed it on the table in the family room. She set out enough bowls and chopsticks to include them all. Without saying a word, she and her brother and sisters sat down. The guests pulled up their own chairs and joined them, filled their blue and white porcelain bowls with rice, and began eating. As they ate, they continued nagging May. She kept her head down, but her mind was asking for more faith that her father would return from the labor camp. She must prepare for that day, as she would for Christ's return. The evening grew dark before her guests left. "Take your time, May. Think about it. Going to Xinjiang is patriotic and heroic. Consider the parade the government will organize in your honor." "What a chance! You young people have opportunities I never had," elder uncle chimed in loudly. "If I were young, I'd go." "I'll be honored to see you go," said younger uncle. When at last they closed the door, May felt relieved. Exhausted, she pulled out the drawer that held her Japanese-style bed and flopped onto it. But a knock interrupted her moment of peace. "May I talk to you alone?" "I've got something very important to say," elder uncle spoke nervously as they walked to the family room. "I'm a no good uncle to you, and I feel terrible." "No, you're a good uncle," May replied politely. "Maybe I should listen more carefully to your advice." "I hate what I'm doing to my family," he said as he sat at the table. "I'm here only because the neighborhood committee forced me. They gave me a 3-month leave of absence from my job with pay to help them persuade you to go to Xinjiang." Shocked and hurt by her uncle's admission of betrayal, May wasn't completely surprised, for she had suspected him. "I'll be honest with you, May, elder uncle continued as he leaned across the table. "My brother isn't like me. I'm afraid he believes in the Xinjiang movement. But I believe we Chinese should favor family over government. You're part of my family, and I want to help you do whatever you want. Can we talk?" May didn't trust him. Both uncles had betrayed her. Was elder uncle confessing, trying to make amends by claiming to be two-timing the government? Or was he playing another trick? Had he been sent on a fact-finding mission to learn what she really thought? Fearing the worst, she said nothing. "I don't blame you for not trusting me, May," he pointed to his nose. "I came alone because I didn't want my brother to know. Our meeting must remain a secret." She decided he was telling the truth. Maybe she'd risk being frank with him. Weighing her words so as not to betray her feelings, she asked, "Elder uncle, do you really think I should go to Xinjiang province?" "Not if you don't want to," he smiled. "I'm a city girl. I don't know anything about country life. Shanghai's my home, and it's got everything I need. If I go, I'll have to leave my brother and sisters. I have no relatives or friends in Xinjiang. A valid concern, Mei Mei. Elder Uncle leaned back in his chair. What little I know about Xinjiang is that life there is very different from Shanghai. The province has many minorities who don't look, dress, think, or act like us civilized Chinese, he continued condescendingly. They're also poor and backward. The Uyghurs are Muslim fanatics, and the Cossacks are nomadic and primitive. In fact, he laughed, there's even a big-nosed minority group of Russian descent. We Chinese don't like any of them, because they aren't as sophisticated and advanced as we are. They don't share our history and heritage. I have no idea how those minorities would treat a Chinese girl, or how you could live with them. So you think I should stay in Shanghai, Elder Uncle? You do have your family to think about. Elder Uncle, there's another reason why I can't go. She poured boiling water from a thermos. What's that? I believe my father is going to be released someday, and I want to be here to help him resettle in Shanghai. You're a loyal daughter. Elder Uncle sipped some water. Much more loyal than I. I betrayed you because I feared the neighborhood committee. Never mind that, Uncle, Mei Mei said. If you think I should stay in Shanghai, how can I live if the government doesn't offer me a job? You can wait 5 years for them to assign you to another job. Elder Uncle put down his cup. But Elder Uncle, how could I survive? He leaned back and thought for a moment. You can work for me, Mei Mei, though I can't pay you much. Would you wash my family's clothes once a week? Without hesitation, Mei Mei replied, I'll be glad to. Then it's settled, Elder Uncle said with a smile. I'll pay you 5 renminbi a week, but we'll have to do everything secretly. When do you want me to wash clothes for you? That's a problem, Elder Uncle laughed nervously. I'm still working for your neighborhood committee until the end of the summer. I'm afraid of them, so I'll continue to yell and shout at you whenever they're present. I've got no other choice. I don't want trouble. With money comes obligation. But I've got a plan. It'll satisfy both them and you. Listen carefully. Mei Mei listened. When he'd explained, she agreed to cooperate. The next day, when Mei Mei returned home from school, her uncles and the neighborhood committee members were waiting with the usual nagging and demands. When she said nothing, they became more agitated. Elder Uncle shouted even louder than he had before. Amused inwardly, Mei Mei dared not show it. Busying herself in the kitchen boiling water, she hoped her face gave no hint of her thoughts. When the water had boiled, she served her unwanted guests. After what seemed like eons, the neighborhood committee members finally left. A few moments later, Elder Uncle was back at the door. Come quickly, he said. At the bottom of the steps waited a rickshaw. They climbed inside and closed the curtain. She felt the driver lift the bars and pull. They bumped and swayed as the driver ran towards his destination. Eventually, after numerous jolts and turns, they felt the front end lowered. Elder Uncle opened the curtain, helped her step down, and paid the driver. After climbing several flights of stairs, he led her into a long hallway lined with windows. At the end of the hall sat a basin full of clothes, a faucet, a wooden board, and a large bar of soap. Long rays of sunlight shone in at an angle, revealing dust particles dancing in the air. It's all set up. You can hang the clothes out the windows. Mei Mei saw bamboo poles attached below the window, pointing over the street below. Across the street were clothes hanging from similar poles. Elder Uncle left. Squatting, she went right to work. She dumped the clothes from the basin onto the cement floor and filled the basin with water. Then she dunked the clothes into cold water, wrung them out, and laid them on the board. She rubbed soap into them, soaked them again, beat them against the board, and wrung them out again. Elder uncle must have collected all the clothes from all the relatives, she said to herself. I've never seen such a pile. She finished washing as darkness crept into the room. Her uncle was pleased and handed her the promised 5 renminbi. Holding it in her hand, she knew that even though the money wasn't much, she had the security she needed. By the end of summer, as her uncle had predicted, the neighborhood committee quit visiting her home. Elder uncle resumed his regular work, and nothing more was said about the Xinjiang movement. As the weeks turned to months and the months into years, Mei Mei's hands suffered from wringing out clothes in the chilly water. But when she was tempted to complain, she remembered her father, and with renewed vigor worked a little harder, grateful for her uncle's kindness and God's goodness. With each twist of the cloth and trickle of water, she thanked God in faith that she'd see her father again, a reunion made possible by a weak, frightened, betraying uncle who felt guilty enough to come up with a solution. The end of Chapter 22. Chapter 23. Icy Canals and Wild Dogs. Mr. Wong's unit had the difficult task of breaking the ice to clear irrigation ditches so the water could flow to the barley fields for the benefit of the camp guards. Hacking away at the ice with pick and shovel in the cold late spring seemed harder when Mr. Wong knew he'd never eat a morsel of the grain. After he broke the ice into blocks and lifted the blocks onto the bank, he had to be careful not to allow the icy water to seep into his boots where it could freeze. He recalled one prisoner who had allowed his hands to get frostbitten. When the team returned to the burrow, he had poured hot water over his hands and his fingers fell off. No one in the camp could ever forget his screams. Each prisoner was supposed to clear 1,000 feet of clogged canal every day, and anyone who didn't achieve his quota would be punished. They had to load some of the ice chunks onto a wagon and haul them to the camp for the cooks. At the end of one particular day, Mr. Wong felt tired, but more lonely than tired. The day had been so busy, and he had been around the other prisoners from early morning till late afternoon. He wished he could have time to himself just to think. After the ice was loaded on the wagon, the driver ordered the prisoners to sit on the back. A guard hitched the horses to the cart. The lash from the driver's whip startled the horses, and they lurched forward. The prisoners sitting on the back of the wagon tried to avoid contact with the ice. The long, bumpy ride to the prison compound caused painful jostling for Mr. Wong. He needed to stretch his legs. "Stop! Stop!" he called repeatedly until he caught the driver's attention. "What do you want?" the driver asked as he pulled the reins to slow the horses. "The road is so rough that it makes me sore," Mr. Wong said, flashing his most charming smile. "Request permission to walk back to camp." The driver stopped and said, "You can walk back. I doubt you'll try to escape, but hurry. If you get lost and try to sleep out here, you'll never survive the cold. It's dangerous in these hills after dark, for tigers and bands of wild dogs prowl this area." "Thank you. I'm not afraid. My friend Jesus will protect me." The driver didn't respect Mr. Wong's belief, but he liked his work habits and trusted him. The guards and team leaders who had observed Mr. Wong long enough became fond of him. Mr. Wong felt grateful to the driver as they exchanged farewell glances. "Be careful," the driver warned as the cart rolled on down the road. Mr. Wong watched it rattle and bounce until it disappeared around a bend. All alone, Mr. Wong felt the peaceful stillness of the fields, flanked by the majestic mountains of Tibet. He loved a brisk walk and reveled in the natural beauty. He felt grateful for this rare opportunity to appreciate the handiwork of the real God. Relaxed, he felt he had the whole world to himself. After walking several miles, he noticed a rapid movement ahead. A band of wild dogs, having caught his scent, charged up the road toward him with fierce eyes, rumbling growls, and bared teeth. He remembered hearing rumors that the hungry wild dogs near the compound were man-eaters, and he didn't wish to be lunch for these beasts. On and on they came. It almost seemed as though he could hear their stomachs growling in anticipation. He imagined them leaping through the air, knocking him down, tearing him into shreds, gnawing on his bones and licking their chops afterward. Shivers shot through him. He couldn't move, fearing his approaching death. With no place to hide, and no way to outrun the hungry animals, he fell to his knees before the wild dogs, spread his arms wide in the form of a crucifix, and closed his eyes and prayed. My friend Jesus, save my life from these dangerous dogs. Take away their appetite. You closed the mouths of the hungry lions, preventing them from injuring your servant Daniel. Since you protected Daniel in a den of lions, I know you can also shut the mouths of these wild dogs for me. Thank you, Jesus, my friend, for helping me. Amen. Mr. Wong heard a slight whimper and opened his eyes. The wild dogs surrounded him with their tails tucked between their legs. They were transformed from ferocious beasts into what seemed like friendly pets. When he stood up, the dogs wagged their tails, inviting him to stroke them behind their ears. A broad smile crossed Mr. Wang's face as they stretched out their forepaws and yawned in a little welcome dance. They even seemed to recognize him, or, he suspected, they saw in him someone else. Squatting, he reached out his hand, and the wild dogs spilled over each other in their attempts to lick his palm. Their tongues felt wet and rough. Suddenly, the dogs turned and ran up a hill, and Mr. Wang resumed his walk, praising his friend Jesus. The end of chapter 23 of The Man Who Couldn't Be Killed.